touch base with them would be once a month or every couple of months with something about real.
Don't rush these things.
Yeah, funny, John.
Yeah, you told him to follow you, and then you just walked away.
Yeah, I know. I'm the one that always leaves my cell phone on, so I want to make sure I turn it off. Like a patience.
You just have to put it up next to you, so you're
Okay.
you telling it like follow me
I'm telling it to follow me. I'm not getting much following here.
because you're telling it to stop.
Oh, I am.
You
Okay.
just have to go like this.
Oh, I do have to
Yeah,
go
just
like
next
that.
to
All
you.
right. See, Jonathan, I still haven't learned.
Nope, there. They got you.
Okay.
Maybe
Yeah.
you,
See,
got,
that's
maybe
not
you
my
held it on for
fault.
too long.
I held my hand up too long.
Yeah, once you see it blink, then you're good.
Okay. All right. Great.
It's following it.
It's finally great. Good morning, everybody. So I want to go over a lot of the forms we talked about last week, but then also I've prepared a number of questions I think that you should anticipate. And I have some responses, but the other side is I think the responses that you have are invaluable. So what I'm going to do is go through the forms quickly, once again, to be sure that we understand which forms are to be used based upon certain circumstances. And then we're going to go through the series of questions that I have. And those people that are attending remotely are fortunate because they're not here and they're not going to be in the position that they have to answer any of these questions. So first of all, has everybody turned their business cards in? Okay, great. So the first thing I want to talk about is the security deposit disclosure and addendum, something we talked about last week. Landlords can only charge 1 month security deposit unless they own only 2 properties consisting of no more than 4 units. And it can only be an LLC, an individual, a family trust. And if one of the members of the LLC is a corporation, they cannot charge more than 1 month's security deposit. Keep that in mind, right? And then listing brokers. So now that the transition is taking place, if you've used the prior listing contract, you have an obligation to modify that. And we would be using form DMLA, Disclosure Modification of Listing Contract. And on that form, it's going to talk about the fact that we can no longer offer compensation on the MLS. And also, even though there are no numbers mentioned on that form, the default response on that form is, in the event when I have you sign this, Mr. Seller, because originally you signed a listing contract and it stated you're authorizing me to offer compensation on the MLS, and I can no longer do that in compliance with the settlement. It's not going to say I'm no longer going to collect a total of 5%. It's just going to say that the listing contract is reduced by the amount of compensation that we both agreed to be offered on the MLS. So if I have a 5% listing, on that listing contract, I stated I was going to be offering 2.5% to the cooperating broker. That now would be eliminated. If you never offered compensation, or excuse me, in that listing contract, you never stated that you were going to offer any stated amount of compensation, then all it's doing is just modifying the fact that you're telling the seller, are you no longer able to offer compensation on the MLS? So regardless, to be in compliance with the settlement, we need to modify the prior listing contracts that were in existence. That could be a problem for us otherwise. We don't want to be in violation of the settlement agreement. Any questions about that? Any prior listing contracts? If you're not using a new form, which is dated, I think, July 2024, you need to modify those listing contracts.
So Rich, what if in that situation, you entered 5% total commission, but you didn't enter anything on the, to offer the, you just left it blank where you're.
You just left it blank where you're no longer obligating yourself to offer anything to the cooperating broker. When using the form DMLA, you're entitled to the full amount of compensation that's shown in that listing contract. So the only thing that's being modified is the fact that you're no longer able to offer compensation on the MLS.
Should we have that discussion with the seller to let them know that, or
I think I'm not going to bring that up to the seller to say that no longer can I offer any compensation as based upon the broker's compensation policies. I would think if I'm receiving an offer and the buyer is asking that the seller pay the buyer's broker's commission, I would reduce my commission by a like amount and have the seller pay the buyer's broker's commission. So if you receive an offer, then a residential purchase contract, and let's just look at that quickly. And I happen to have that available, I think. I thought I did. I know I do. How come there's no arrow there, Carlos?
that's all the forms you have open?
Really? I thought I had the, anyways. In section 3G3 of the purchase contract, it talks about compensation in which the buyer is requesting the seller to pay to the buyer's broker. If in the event that broker, or excuse me, the buyer is asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker's commission, the easiest approach would be to have the seller agree to it and reduce the commission you're entitled to by a like amount, assuming that's acceptable to you. So if I have a 5% contract and I never stated in my listing contract that I was going to offer compensation to the cooperating broker, if somebody asks for 2%, the buyer asks to have the seller pay 2% to the buyer's broker. We would have the seller pay it, and we would issue a credit to the seller in regards to the commission that the seller owes us. Now I see faces. I'm going to make sure everybody understands that. And if there are questions, Gina's not here today.
Well, the alternative in that situation would be the seller pays you the 5%, and they're also going to pay them another 2% if they're asking for it, right?
That's really what could happen, as a matter of fact. And I don't think any seller is going to have the expectation that they're paying 5% plus an additional 2%. I think they're going to be very dismayed by that, as a matter of fact. And I had that in there. Shit. There it is. Okay. Let's just look at that. I'm going to just scan down to section 3G3 of the RPA. So under additional finance terms, you can see section 3G3, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. So you should expect probably in every single offer that you receive as the listing agent that the buyer is going to have that box checked. And so in that case, they're asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker's commission. And if you're the listing agent and you have a listing contract in which you never stated specifically how much you're going to be offering, you can just tell the seller, accept it. And the only commission you're going to be paying me is going to be net of the amount of money that you're paying the cooperating broker. So I have 5% commission and the buyer's broker asks for 2%, you would net 3%. You don't have to do that, but of course, the seller is going to be looking at what their net proceeds are and realistic in regards to making a decision whether they should accept that offer or not. And if you had a contract in which you specified it's a 5% listing and 2.5% was specifically listed in that listing contract to be offered to the cooperating broker, and you modified it through form DMLA, you would only be entitled to 2.5% anyways. Under that example. Is that clear to everybody? I want to make sure that we all understand that. Okay. And this is a form that one would expect to be received with an offer received from a buyer. section 1A. Theoretically, they might put 2% in here. All right, this is what the buyer's broker, excuse me, the buyer's asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker. And then section 1B, it talks about the seller's maximum exposure in regards to the commission to be paid to the buyer's broker. So with that, when the contract is accepted, how does the seller actually know what the buyer's obligated to pay? So there's two different forms, the PSRA and the BRBC. And on those documents, which are the buyer representation agreements, it's going to specify exactly how much the buyer has committed to pay the buyer's broker. Let's just open those so we have a complete understanding. So this is one of the two representation agreements. This is the watered down version. And if we look at section B1, we would fill in, if I'm representing a buyer, exactly how much I want to be paid by that buyer. And in the event, in your negotiations with the seller, the buyer asks the broker, excuse me, the buyer asks the seller to pay the buyer's broker 3%. If you have section B1 filled in at 2%, the seller's obligation will never exceed 2%. So the seller's obligation to pay the buyer's broker's commission is never going to exceed the amount that's shown in the buyer representation agreements, whether it's this version, the PSRA, or the buyer representation agreement. And keep in mind, there's no reason to submit these documents when you're submitting an offer, but you're going to be asked, or most likely will be asked by the listing agent or the seller at some point in time to produce these documents to validate exactly what the buyer's obligation is in regards to paying the buyer's broker's commission. Additionally, escrow is probably going to want that. Because let's say in an example that the buyer agreed to pay their agent 3%, but the seller only agreed to pay 2% to the buyer's broker. So there's still that 1% differential. You're going to have to submit that document to escrow, as it is an irrevocable demand on the buyer to pay the difference in that commission. So the seller has agreed to pay 2%, but the buyer's broker's agreement specifies 3%. So there's a 1% differential the seller's not paying. To document that, you'll be submitting that document to the escrow holder, and they will then charge the seller 2% in my example, and they'll be charging the buyer 1% for the additional amount of money that the buyer has agreed to pay the buyer's broker. So a question that came up from Gina, there's a couple of things that came up. Well, what if I have a 3% buyer representation agreement? And can I reduce the compensation that the buyer's obligated to pay me? Yes, we can do that. So if I have 3%, for some reason I'm willing to assist the buyer by reducing my commission down to 2%, we can do that. But then the other question was, and I spoke to the assistant general counsel for CRMLS, and he wasn't completely sure. But if we look at the seller payment to buyer's broker in section 1B, it talks about the seller is only obligated to pay the buyer's broker the lesser of the amount specified in section 1A, or the amount the buyer's obligated to pay the buyer's broker pursuant to their buyer representation agreement. So once again, the seller is only obligated to pay the lesser of the two. But I have a buyer representation agreement of 3%, and the seller agrees to pay the 3%, but me as the buyer's broker thereafter decides to discount my fees. It appears as if I can do that. And the seller still has to pay the 3% that they agreed to through the transaction. So let's try and go through that one more time.
Or offer a credit towards closing costs for your buyer.
You can do that. You can offer credit to your buyer, right, for closing costs. That's a simple way of doing it. So I have a buyer representation agreement in which the buyer's agreeing to pay me 3%. the seller has agreed to pay that entire 3% to the buyer's broker. And then during the transaction, the buyer's broker, out of generosity, decides to give a closing cost credit of 1%. The seller's still going to be obligated to pay the 3%. That's what I'm being told right now at this point in time. But the assistant general counsel wasn't actually necessarily aware of that. And he was supposed to be getting validation from Ed Zorn, who is CRMLS general counsel, to confirm what he told me. And I have not yet gotten that confirmation.
Probably reaching out to all the.
Oh, yeah.
attorneys.
And the comment to me was, well, these forms are drafted and we never know what the outcome is going to be. Isn't that reassuring? Yeah, very reassuring. And then when you're speaking to your clients, the broker compensation advisory could be very advantageous in regards to discussing what is taking place. So I want you to keep that in mind, and it's very, very helpful. It tells them that we must have a written agreement, and it's all due to the litigation. It's not law yet, but it is going to be law January 1st in California. So it's all subject to the settlement, the NAR settlement. And then it talks about the seller paying the compensation and the changes in practice. I think there are probably going to be a lot of people, a lot of clients you're dealing with, especially buyers, that don't understand the fact that they may have to pay you commission. So this is going to help them possibly understand. The new residential listing agreement, a couple things I wanted to point out. So it is consisting of more than one document. Before it was just a listing contract, it was the agency disclosure, so on and so forth. And remember, if we have a listing contract in which the beginning date is today, but the start marketing date is October 1st, under section 7D of that listing contract, we would put a start marketing date. We would be obligated to register that listing. Now there's a separate form addressing that, and that's the MLSA, Multiple Listing Service Agreement. So what I want to point out in this is that if we have in section A1 a beginning date of today, I'm not sure what the date is today. Thank you. But really, we're not going to start marketing it until September 1st. We need to go down to the other attachment that's in this packet. It's moving slow. The multiple listing service addendum. And under section 3D2, seller instructs broker to begin marketing the property to the public on, in our example, September 1st. So we have a beginning date of today. We're not going to actually start marketing it till September 1st. So under that circumstance, you have an obligation to register the listing. And if you don't, within 2 business days of taking the listing, based on the beginning date, or the later of the beginning date, or the date of the last signature, you're going to be in violation. It's a $1,500 fine. So we want to avoid that. So section 3D2 was previously in section 7D of the prior listing contract. So now we have 2 different documents that we have to complete if we have a start marketing date that is different than the beginning date of the listing contract. Does anyone have any questions about that? No? Okay. We have a question.
Later on, for the section 3D2, and later on, change the date. So we don't need any other documents. We just need to the seller for in writing, even email or text message to say, hey, I cannot do that date, and we just in writing, that should be fine. That would be fine. Right?
You can do that. You can just have a written email from them instructing you to postpone the start marketing date, for example, October 1st, or modification of terms to the listing contract. Either way, both are going to be acceptable. And that should be dated before we do any of this. So if we have a start marketing date of September 1st, and we receive an email from the seller telling us to begin marketing the property on October 1st, but their instructions were September 2nd. That's a $500 fine. So any instructions from the seller to change the status of the listing must be received before you make those status changes. I think you and Mike had an example of 8 different hold changes. So when you put a property in hold, you must have written instructions before you change the status to hold, for example. Don't put yourself in the position. You can tell you can count on your fellow agents to tell on you. Any questions about that? I just want to move through the forms quickly because I think we've gone through a lot of the forms, but I want to make sure that you understand what the forms, when the form should be used itself. So now I'm holding an open house. Can I let a buyer in? You can, but it's suggested that once again, at minimum, you have a buyer that comes into your open house, sign into the open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in form, because it tells them I'm not representing you. Any information I give you is for the benefit of the seller. And not only that, but why wouldn't you have a sign-in form? I would be hesitant to allow anybody into that property unless I had them register in here, because they could make a claim that you actually were acting in an agency relationship with them, answering questions. So this at least puts them on notice. Okay, so you should be doing that. And then let's assume you want to have a property showing and representation agreement. This is just a buyer representation agreement, but it's limited to 3 properties. And this is non-exclusive, meaning you're not necessarily protected. So to protect yourself, you must do something. You must show the property. You must run a CMA. You have to do certain things like that to protect your interests. Now, also what's interesting about this thing, if we look at section 4C, cancellation rights and notice, effective upon receipt. So the default response is if a buyer signs this form and they wish to cancel this representation agreement, it's effective upon receipt of the written notice. You can change that. Now, I think this is something to pay attention to because the questions I have prepared, I think are going to be questions that a buyer is going to ask, well, if I sign this, can I cancel? So you need to be prepared to answer those questions. So you can make it 30 days after receipt if you want, or you can allow it effective upon receipt. What's going to benefit you, or what is going to convince a buyer to sign this document? I think it's going to be based upon each individual discussion, as a matter of fact. And then the BRBC, the buyer representation agreement. The default, once again, it's non-exclusive. So if you allow the default response, you have to show that you've done a certain task, and setting them up in a client gateway is not going to assure you of being compensated if they find a property. You have to show a property, you have to run a CMA, you have to do things like that. And not only that, but the cancellation rights. If we look at section F, cancellation rights and notice, the default is the buyer can cancel this upon your written receipt of the cancellation notice. So you can change that. You can extend that if it's not exclusive. But if it is exclusive, meaning no matter where they buy or who helped them, you're entitled to compensation. So keep that in mind. It's only a 30-day notice. The contract can't exceed more than 3 months. And yes, it can be extended. So there's no prohibition in regards to the number of extensions that you can obtain in regards to this buyer representation agreement. And then also something that's important to be sure, if you believe you have an exclusive representation agreement signed, you have to do 2 things. We're going to specify in section E1 the amount of compensation. It's going to be 2%, say, for example. But then also, we're going to change this. I need to find it. Right above section A2, hopefully everybody can see that. The default is non-exclusive. If we check the box for exclusive, We also have two other areas of this document that we have to complete to assure ourselves of an exclusive agreement. And it's right here, section 15. This is the signature page. So if it is exclusive representation, we must have the buyer initial that section. In addition to that, section 16, we would once again reiterate the compensation that we filled in above. So if it's 2% or 3%, once again, put that amount in here to assure yourself of exclusive representation. If it's not completed properly, you may not have an exclusive contract. So that's very important. Any questions about that?
Rich Shirley was asking about a listing, if they want a coming soon status, do they still use the MLS service addendum?
Yes, you still use the MLS service addendum. It's always attached no matter what.
For coming soon?
And then well, no matter what, it's always attached
Yeah.
to the residential listing contract. And you would still use the coming soon form as you have in the past. So that's one aspect that hasn't changed. Any other questions? So I prepared a number of questions, and I think these are questions that a buyer is going to ask you, and I think this is something you should be prepared for. So let's just go through those questions. So let's talk about a buyer that's a bargain hunter. Is there any way we can negotiate the commission rate? I feel like it's a bit high. So when I start drawing names, I'm hoping somebody's going to give me an answer what their suggested response is going to be. And no response is wrong. Sarah Park, how convenient. So Sarah, I'm the buyer and you want 5%, and I think that's high. What is your response going to be? I'm the buyer. Yeah, Sarah, I want to work with you, but I think the commission you're charging me is really high. Is there anything we can do? Well, that's a strong position to take. I like that. I don't know if everyone heard Sarah's response. You can find a different agent. So I prepared some responses, and if anybody else wants to add to this, and that's what I'm hoping we're going to do here, is I think those are things you need to be prepared for when you're asking people to sign these contracts. But here's a longer response that I prepared, and I'm going to be reading this. Unfortunately, I don't have this memorized, but I expect everybody in here to memorize all these things. And then I think, it's helpful when someone's, asking you this, give confirmation in regards to what their concerns are. So say, I understand that you're looking to minimize your costs, and I appreciate your transparency, right? We want to know what they're thinking. However, I want to explain the value that my commission represents. So as your buyer's agent, my commission covers a wide range of services, including expert market knowledge and guidance, personalized home searching and matching, skill negotiation and advocacy, coordination of inspections, due diligence and closing, then access to my network of trusted professionals. Now, Sarah, think about the number of times that you have helped your clients with contractors and all the different people that are involved in a transaction. But you developed that list over time, haven't you? And not only that, but I think that's something that's important. They respond to you. How often do people contact a contractor or a service provider, and they can't get them to respond because it's a $200 job? Nobody recognizes that till it's too late and after the fact. So that's a lot of value in that. So my commission is a reflection of the expertise, time, and effort I bring to the table to ensure a successful transaction. So by working with me, you'll get a dedicated, experienced advocate in your corner, increase negotiating power, potential savings, streamline communication coordination, access to off-market listing and exclusive opportunities, and a smooth transaction. So with that being said, I'm happy to discuss potential options and alternatives that work for both of us. You could talk about a flat fee structure. So what if they tell you that someone else has offered me a flat fee structure? Is that flat fee going to be dependent upon a successful close of escrow? Are they going to be charging hourly? I think there's going to be a lot of different commission structures that are coming out that we're not accustomed to. So those are questions I think that maybe you want to raise. And then is it performance based, for example? So my next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to discuss with everybody here. So if buyer asks for a commission, if I'm presenting buyer part, so they ask, selling you charge too much, or they don't want to pay any commission. Because I miss a lot of meetings,
Mhm.
I'm just wondering if that work or not. What about this? What about if I say, hey, I tell buyer you don't need to pay anything, but let's say the property is $800,000 for the leasing price. What about if I'm gonna ask the buyer, were you willing to offer like $50,000, and I will ask seller to pay my commission, so you don't need to pay anything. I think that way, especially for the buyer, they don't have a lot of cash.
Well, I think that's the way to structure it.
But yeah, for the monthly payment, the mortgage, the $50,000 for the commission, to the monthly payment, it won't be that much.
Mhm.
Do you think we can do that?
Absolutely, you can do that. I don't know if I would take that approach initially during my discussions, because I'd be thinking, God, you want me to pay $50,000 more so I could pay you the commission? I think that's probably something that I would approach after the fact. I think more of my discussion would be, I know that you're looking at that commission. I think we need to, first of all, we don't want to necessarily address and say, oh, it's not too high. We have to give them the reasons why. I think we want to install some doubt. But you can also say that we're going to ask the seller to pay. That would be that's going to be one of the first things I'm going to do, that we are going to be asking the seller to pay. And I think that's something that Jay had brought up before when we talked about taking listing contracts, is he's going to bring it up to a seller and say, you should expect to have a buyer ask you to pay the buyer's agent's commission. I don't think that's going to be a discussion I'm going to have at that point in time. I think that's going to be a part of the negotiation, because I really believe that from a seller's perspective, I should be looking at whatever the net amount is. Let the seller counter, as opposed to initially telling the buyer, well, we can offer $50,000 more. I think that might be harder for them to accept at that point in time of that initial discussion.
So that's definitely the idea could work.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. There's nothing that stops you from doing that, offering more.
Because, some buyers, they don't have a lot of cash. I think if pretty much they pay the commission to like a monthly payment for mortgage kind of,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that might work.
I agree. I think it might. It's just how much. If the asking price is X amount, are they going to be willing to offer more than the asking price? I think if they're going to be willing to offer more than the asking price, I think the discussion should consist of the seller's going to be looking at what they net most. So maybe that's how we should structure our offer. And that's what I'm going to bring to you, but also keeping in mind, I'm going to take into account what the appraised value is, and what the other offers may be consisting of, because I think that's part of what you need to convince the buyer. I'm an expert in regards to also competing against other buyers in regards to multiple offers. And unfortunately, we still have a lot of multiple offers.
So if seller wanting to pay the commission, so they just need to counter the buyer back saying address, like seller gonna pay the commission, right? Because I'm asked to find out.
Yeah, I think that's what we should expect. What would you do, Sarah? Would you ask the seller to just counter back, because knowing that the buyer's agent, the buyer asked you to pay the buyer's agent's commission?
So I just in this area, we have multiple offers, so
Mhm.
it's very hard to ask to the seller
To pay any of the commission.
So our main goal is to find the house, like so if we ask to get the commission, so who's gonna accept our offers? So main goal, we have to explain to the buyer is our main goal is we need to buy the house, not that taking the the seller's money or the buyer's money. So it's keep them to focus on what they want.
As opposed, right, because they're going to be spending the money no matter what. That's really what it's going to come down to.
Accepting the offer, so either raising the offer price or the buy that pay for the buyer's commission.
So do you discuss with the seller that really they should be looking at what they're netting most as opposed to what the offer price is?
Yeah.
So next question that'll be out there. Let's see.
There's a question.
Oh, there's a question?
From Samantha.
So if my buyer's offer is accepted and escrow is opened, but the buyer representation broker compensation agreement states a 3% commission, while the seller only agrees to 2%, which form is to be used for modifying the buyer's agent's commission to 2%? There is no form necessarily. We would just, I think it would be as simple as we could do one of two things. We could just issue an addendum to the buyer representation agreement saying we're willing to accept 2%, or we can probably simply just have escrow issue a credit to the buyer against the commissions that we're entitled to. But that's a good question, and since we may have to submit the buyer representation agreement, it may require a modification of the buyer representation broker commission form, or an addendum to that, which all parties sign, which would be us and the buyer in that case. So next question. I bought homes before. I never had to sign anything like this. Why is it necessary now? Who wants to take that question? Sam. So Sam, the buyer says to you, I bought homes before. I never had to sign something like this. Why is it necessary now?
Show them an article about the suit, and let them know about the fines that I would receive if I were to show them homes without getting that form signed. Like pretty plain and simple, which tell them that I have to pay $2,500 a home to show you homes, and that's not a risk that I'm going to take for you, no matter how much I like you.
Yeah, Gina actually had an example a week or two ago. She was contacted by a prospective tenant, and the tenant said to her, well, I've spoken to 3 other agents who are showing me property, and they're not asking me to sign a tenant representation agreement. So it's very prominent right now. And I don't know, Gina, I think also, first, it's a violation, right? And then as of January 1st, it's going to be a violation of California law in regards to showing your property, whether it's for purchase or tenant representation. And then as the agent, it's foolish because you're not going to be compensated. There is no compensation forthcoming to you. Why would you even consider doing something like that? Yeah, very good answer.
And if they go with somebody else, it's not like you can go after them, because then you'll get fined.
Yeah, that's right. And then how about another question? I thought agents got paid by the seller's commission split. Why am I being asked to pay you separately? Once again, it's associated with the NAR settlement. We have an obligation to do that. It's going to be law in California as of January 1st. We can negotiate with the seller, or you can negotiate with the seller to pay my commission. There's no assurance that they will. The seller, no matter what, is always going to look at what they're netting. That's going to be the most, I think, the predominant aspect when evaluating an offer. That would be me, at least. I'm going to look at what am I netting from any of these offers. How about this one? I'm considering finding homes of my own. Why should I pay you when I can do a lot of the work on my own? Anybody want to answer that? Well, I came up with a response. Well, I understand. I think a lot of people feel this way. If anyone has read these articles and you read the comments from people that read these articles, they think that we are trash, we're all overpaid, and we do nothing. That's really what's coming down to, at least the people that are commenting, these keyboard warriors, right? They're just nasty as can be. Now, maybe people, when they're looking at us in the eye, aren't going to say things like that. But maybe you can say something like, I understand you feel confident in your ability to handle the work on your own. I appreciate your enthusiasm. But let me share something with you. As a professional, I bring a depth of knowledge and experience, and this is very true, that goes just beyond listing homes. And I can analyze values. I have effective marketing and advertising techniques, skilled negotiation and conflict resolution, And once again, I have a network of trusted professionals. So while you may be capable of handling some of the aspects, I'm there to make sure it's a smooth transaction. And then I understand you're looking to save on commissions, and I understand that, but consider, let's look at the potential downfall. Well, overpricing or underpricing the property, unqualified buyers, or maybe wasted time or missed opportunities for negotiations and concessions, and then potential legal liabilities. And I think that's something that we face at every single transaction. And you might tell them, I'm willing to work with you. I think sometimes you need to just address that. But if you just roll over, they're going to take advantage of you. And once again, just reaffirm all of the things that you bring to the table. And then how about this? How can I be sure you'll work in my best interest and not just focus on the commission? Well, I completely understand. And I need to earn your respect, and I respect your caution. I want to assure you that I'm committed to transparency, honesty, and open communication. So let me share a little bit about my background. Tell them how many transactions you closed. What if you haven't closed one transaction? Well, what you should be doing is understanding what the market is. So reports that we've been sent out recently, it gives you information in regards to what the market conditions are. So if you haven't closed any transactions, you don't need to tell them, I have never closed a transaction, but go on, you should be telling them about the information that's available to you. What is the sales to list price, for example? How many days are homes on the market in this area? How many homes are actually available? So that's something I think that will help you build their trust. Anyone else have something you would like to add to that? Okay, no, all right. And then, so we've gone through the two representation agreements, the PSRA, property showing, and something agreement, I can't remember the name, and then the BRBC, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So when you're sitting in front of them and somebody says, how long is the agreement valid for? 30 days? No, the agreement is going to be based upon the duration of time that you put in there from the beginning. So there's going to be a beginning and ending date. And then what about terminating the agreement early? What is your response going to be if they ask, can I terminate the agreement early? Sarah?
Yeah, I have questions. Yeah, I'm sorry. So is PSRA?
Yes.
Why this form and the who is sending to?
The PSRA, so the property showing agreement, that's something that you would be providing the buyer, but you're listing no more than 3 specific properties.
So then what is different in PRBC?
The BRBC is all encompassing. So you can specify all of Orange County on the BRBC, whereas the PSRA is going to be limited to 3 individual identified properties. So let's just pull it up. So
And
we
no
can-
more than 30 days. Contract.
Well, does the PSRA have a termination date of 30 days?
Yes. It can't go longer than 30 days. Then the BRBC is 90 days, right?
So the property showing and representation agreement.
And then A.
Yep, you're right, section A, 4A. So the time frame is no more than 30 days for the PSRA.
The PSRA is for only, no?
It's only, no, so there would be 3 things you should be prepared for at an open house. You should have the form open house, visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. And all it's doing is getting information and telling the buyer or the potential buyer that you're not representing them. So you have no contractual obligation, and neither do they. If they wish to have you represent them simply for that property, and they don't want to sign a full representation agreement, you can have this specific form signed, just identifying that specific property. So I would have this form with me at my open house, the property showing a representation agreement. And on here, you can specify just the property address specifically that you're showing. It's for representation period not to exceed 30 days. And it is non-exclusive. That's the default language. You become entitled to commissions if you do various things. And under section 5B, for example, if you physically show the property, if you're the listing agent and you're sitting there holding your house open, you show the property, well, you should be protected at that point in time to provide a CMA, something of that nature. So substantive services. So it's an easier way to approach somebody and say, if you want me to represent you, you need to sign this agreement, and I can do that. And then the compensation is going to be filled in on this form also. But the dilemma is going to be, what? Okay. I think when you, and I think it's going to be the sales presentation, when you, if you're the listing agent and the buyer doesn't want to pay your commissions to have representation, you're going to be submitting the purchase contract to the seller. You're going to be checking box 3G3 and attaching form SPVB, asking the seller to pay the commissions for you representing that buyer. Now, that may not be an issue, but I don't know sometimes how the seller is going to look at it. So the limit, there's this only protects you for up to 3 properties, and it's limited to a 30-day time frame. But there's nothing that suggests that you can't extend this for whatever properties you've identified in a PSRA.
If they sign this during the open house, then it becomes exclusive to that particular
To
property.
that particular property, exactly. So it goes from non-exclusive to exclusive since you performed some of the tasks, or at least one of the tasks, that's all it takes, under section 5B2, where you physically entered, which you showed the property. I would say if they came to an open house, they signed it, you showed them around. It seems that to me as if you should be protected, as opposed to them going to another agent and asking them to show the property or negotiating the commissions with another agent. Just submit an offer, for example. And then other questions, are there any penalties for terminating the agreement early? Well, I think that should be a simple one. But how long is the agreement valid for? So we know the PSRA is valid for only 30 days. The BRBC, unless you submit written notice of termination, if you don't change anything, they could just give you written termination right away, and it's terminated. And then the BRBC, the default is non-exclusive once again. And notice a written termination will terminate the agreement. But if you make it exclusive, it's a 30-day written notice. And the BRBC, once again, is for a period of 90 days. So realistically, when you're speaking to a buyer and they're concerned about signing this agreement, they're only limited to a 90-day contract in which they can cancel within 30 days. So it's really to their advantage, not ours, as a matter of fact. What about your commission structure? What percentage of the sales price is your commission? Well, we're going to talk about our professionalism, our marketing strategies, negotiation techniques. But my commission percentage reflects the consistency and excellence of my service, not the sales price of the home and the cost savings I bring for a $2 million home in total far exceed the cost savings of property selling for $1 million. Then also, and this is something that's important to me, I would use this terminology. I'm going to be looking at any single client, and I'm going to make the effort to charge the same percentage to every client. So nobody can ever claim any forms of bias or discrimination. And I would be telling my client that I'm not going to put myself in that position. I charge 2%. I charge 3%. If I don't like you, I'm charging 10%. That's probably discriminatory, isn't it? So if they wonder why it's 2% for a home that's $10 million versus 2% for a home that's $500,000, that's your answer. It could be discriminatory treatment between how I treat you and somebody else. Let's see how you represent my interests. Well, how do you ensure that my goals are prioritized? What about conflict of interest? Well, where could there be a conflict of interest? That's in dual representation. And that could also be dual representation is just any agent with under the same broker's license.
What about if you're representing two buyers for the same property?
That's could be another conflict of interest, as a matter of fact. How are you going to respond to that? I don't know if people are going to be thinking about that. That's a very good question. And then what happens if I don't buy a property? Well, I think maybe what you say, obviously, if you're just charging a percentage, there is no obligation. They have no obligation to pay you anything. What about other things? So when they talk to you, and this is something Cromit told me, when they ask you to discount your fees, that got Karam to wake up back there. And they were questioning Karam to say, well, how much can you give back to me? So what he did, he pulled out his cell phone for me, and his print is much bigger than my cell phone. So he said, well, if it's $20,000 commission, he types in a few numbers and then shows a dollar amount of $6,777. So what's that? That's 33% of the gross commission. So then I'll say, okay, the gross commission is $20,000. After my taxes, after the split with my company, I'm earning $6,777. And on average, I probably spend, he didn't say this, this is my line, and this is probably very true, you probably spend on average for a closed transaction 100 to 120 hours. So what is your hourly rate going to be? $50 to $55 an hour? How much do you pay your plumber to come out to the house? Just a service call is $175. So put it into context for them. I think that's really important. Yeah, it's a $20,000 commission, but this is how much I'm earning for all the things I'm doing. It's like, oh, works for Crum. Right, Crum?
All about take home pay, right? What you are taking home is what's important. So when you show that something, they want, how much can you give me for closing costs? So I show them and I say, okay, how much do you want? Right. So it came down from 20,000 to this. How much do you want?
Yeah, how much do you want?
Yeah. Initially, you wanted $10,000, half the commission. This is all I'm getting. How much do you want? Tell me.
It's a hard thing for them to answer, isn't it?
Yeah. So their numbers would come down.
Yes, in regards to what you're charging. And I'll tell you, I think, talking about bias and discrimination in regards to what your fees are, I think most people can understand things like that. So it helps you fill in that blank, as a matter of fact, of why you think you're entitled to 2% of a $2 million home. It's still just 2% of a $500,000 home.
Also, do they ask their doctor to discount their fees? Do they ask their attorneys to discount their fees?
That's true. Do you ask your physician? Do you even ask your physician what their fees are? Probably not. You may ask your attorney, and sometimes they will discount their fees, but nonetheless, when you need their assistance. And then people can say, well, I can go to my attorney, and have them do all the documentation. Well, is the attorney going to be, let's see, performing a market analysis? They're going to be taking you to all these properties. Do they know what the market conditions are? Do they know what this list of sales price is? I would say absolutely not, right? That's great. The only thing they can do most likely is review the documentation. They can't even access the property without being a member and having a key to access the property. And they're not going to be doing that.
How many hours is it going to take for them to review all the forms?
Yeah. So, right, what do attorneys cost now? If you're lucky, $300 to $500 an hour. If it's 100 to 120 hours, it's a lot more money than what you're going to be paying me, right? And they don't negotiate transactions all day long. So let's see. What about knowledge of the local market? Well, you should have knowledge of the local market. And then tell them, look at all these different things that you actually have access to. Market trends, Neighborhood dynamics and characteristics, schools, transportation. Schools are probably one of the most important characteristics when somebody's buying a house in Irvine. I would say almost anywhere, as a matter of fact. Home values, regulations, zoning requirements. That's an issue, as a matter of fact. Tell them what you do. You stay up to date on all the information. It doesn't matter if you've sold 100 homes, 1,000 homes, or no homes, but you should be able to address that information to create some level of confidence with them. And then let's see, will I have the opportunity to review and approve all documents? You know, how will you ensure that I understand the terms and conditions? What does everyone do here? Well, let's hope we're going through all the documentation with them. We shouldn't be just necessarily sending electronic documents without going through them. Because if there is an issue later on, that's exactly what they're going to say. You just sent it to me. You didn't review the documentation. So how many pages are in HOA disclosures? 100 to 200 pages? How many documents are in just a purchase contract with all the ancillary forms? You think about it, when they're completing their escrow instructions, statement of information, all the documents that are required for them to successfully get through a transaction, those are things you should be reviewing with them. And that's something you should be telling them, is we want them to sign this contract with us. And then once again, I'm working with another agent and they didn't ask me to sign this contract. Well, it's happening a lot, I would say. So that agent is not assured of collecting anything, plus it's a violation of the guidelines and it's going to be a violation of the law. So I think it's something that you should be aware of and letting them know, right? You want to work with somebody who's willing to violate the law. Are you willing to do that? You know, is that somebody you have confidence in? And then can you explain to them exactly how you're paid? Well, you should be able to tell them, we're going to negotiate with the seller to pay. We're going to negotiate with the seller to pay, and they may not pay all of it. And if that's the case, you may be paying the differential, or you might be paying all the commission. I don't want to get into that discussion. I'm telling them they might be paying all the commission. I want them to believe that the seller is going to pay the commission. So Sarah, have you had any offers on listings now in which there's an offer of compensation on the MLS? Not yet. Well, let's see. We've had another example in here which an offer was submitted and there was an offer of compensation on the MLS. And now they're saying, no, we're not going to pay it. Yeah, do you want to work with those people? You may not have a choice. And now the buyer's going to have to pay. So it's pretty unfortunate what's happening. Because remember, if you had, before the transition, before the 13th, at least for CRMLS, if you had an offer and it wasn't accepted, then you're not entitled to the contractual offer of compensation that was formerly on the MLS.
Jeff has a question.
Okay. How is a company like Redfin going to show a rebate back to a buyer on their website if they don't know if the seller will pay the selling agent's compensation? Are they toast going forward? Well, I think that's a good question, Jeff. I haven't looked at their website to see exactly how they're addressing that now, because before they always suggested they would offer some kind of a rebate. But if I'm the seller and I see something like that, I'd be very unlikely to pay the compensation that the buyer's asking me to pay to the buyer's broker. If Redfin's still offering a rebate, and if I'm the seller, I'm going to say, well, why would I pay your buyer's broker all the commission when I just know, Mr. Buyer, you're getting a kickback ultimately, right? They're not doing it anymore.
The only way that they can structure that is if the clients are signing the buy and the listing combined.
I see.
That's it.
Did you hear that, Jeff? So Mary said that the only way they're doing that now is if the principal signs to list and buy property combined. Otherwise, they're not offering any rebates any longer. So that's good to know, because that was something that Redfin agents or that buyers would always throw in our faces. Well, Redfin's offering a rebate. Yeah, but the benefit is you get to work for a Redfin agent or work with a Redfin agent. I'm being very sarcastic about that. I know that Jay would refuse to, or not refuse, but was in the position, if he had a choice, to not choose a Redfin agent. 'Cause I can assure you that they never work weekends. They don't take phone calls after 5 o'clock. So, their whole presentation is changing now, Jeff. It's not gonna be like it once was. So it's equal footing. You're laughing, Sam. So, any questions? There has to be some questions, as a matter of fact.
So, going back to the listing contract, just to clarify, can you pull it up?
Sure.
If the seller agrees to pay your commission, but also agrees to pay you a commission if a buyer shows up that's unrepresented,
Mhm.
you would have to fill out non-buyer, non-agency agreement with the buyer, right? Saying that you're not representing them
That is correct.
because the
So
seller is paying you.
I'll repeat that once I get to the compensation area.
Yeah.
You tell your seller, if I represent, I'm also the buyer, then you get that percent, whatever. that
Yeah, there's a
percent is.
line
Yeah,
for that, yeah.
So section C2, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer's unrepresented. At the time you're going through the listing presentation, you can negotiate with the seller to pay you additional money if the buyer does not have representation. And so the suggestion is here that if you do that, you would actually have the buyer sign a buyer non-agency agreement, because you are not representing them. You're just providing the forms to benefit the seller and nothing more than that. So you can include additional compensation in there. I don't know if that would be a part of my presentation, actually, in a listing contract. I'd probably be more likely to have the buyer sign a representation agreement in which they're committing to pay me a certain percentage. I think that's what I'd be more likely to do, as a matter of fact, in those circumstances. Because right now, it seems like sellers just care about how much they're paying.
So my question to you would be then, you're saying not to do it that way, but you're doing your listing agreement before you even have someone come in that isn't represented. So wouldn't you want to put that in there automatically and state to your seller, and if I am representing a buyer that comes in, 1% is going to go to me under that representation?
Yeah, but you can't even show the buyer the property.
I know, but let's just assume that's what you put in your listing agreement, so your seller knows ahead that there's that opportunity that he's going to have to pay that. If you represent them and then you have an open house.
You can. I just want to get into the discussion because it's just telling the seller they're going to have to pay more. I rather present the offer and then let the seller know that this is what a portion of the buyer's offer is. That would be my approach, but everyone is going to have a different outlook in regards to what they think the best presentation with the seller is. I think with any listing contract or trying to get a listing contract, the more obstacles we present to a seller, the less likely they are to sign that listing contract. Is it going to save them money? I don't know. Maybe I just didn't understand exactly how you're presenting it.
Well, I mean, I'm taking a listing today
Yeah.
and I'm putting this stuff together and I'm gonna tell him up front, you know, there's a possibility that I may end up with a buyer on this. And so you need to know upfront that I'm gonna be charging 1% to you. So it's 2% already on one side and then it's 1% on the separate.
So do you think that's something that the seller is going to find that's advantageous for them?
I'm not saying that it would be, it's not that it is or isn't advantageous, it's, they need to know ahead, because let's say I don't, and then they don't tell them anything at all, and then we have a buyer come in and they don't have anyone, and I become the representative. Now I've got a dual representation, and now I'm gonna put together an offer asking the seller to pay 2% or 1% or whatever it is after the fact. And sometimes I just, you know, it's more, for me, it's, you need to be aware this is a possibility.
Okay, well, I think sometimes awareness is going to cause people to look the other way. So if they have another agent that comes in and says, I'm just going to pay 3% to you as a listing agent, and they never had any discussion that you should be also agreeing to pay another 1% for an unrepresented buyer, how's the seller gonna look at it? But if you think that that's a better sales presentation, that's all that matters. You may never, ever have a buyer, so why does it matter anyways? So why even talk about the fact the seller's gonna be paying you a total of 4% in your discussion, when you don't know if you'll ever have the buyer? You're gonna say something, Masood?
Yeah, just thinking out about basically, regards to that, we all pay attention on the listing side. But what is important now, we all have the opportunity to negotiate on the buyer side as well. So instead of just saying that, I would put it that way, instead of saying that, I deal with it, and then if the buyer comes and then they wanna just, you represent them, instead of asking the seller, I would just say, you have to pay, It could be 1%, 2%. If I'm negotiating, finding a way to negotiate with the buyer to get the commission 2.5%, 3%. If the seller pays 1%, the buyer can cover the rest of it, and then you'll be fine, I'm guessing. Isn't that the whole?
Yeah.
So just mastering the buyer negotiation right now would be the key. We all know how to negotiate the commission with the seller, but we have to find a way to switch around and then make sure buyers sign. As opposed to just, I think Jay said something very important. He said, like, why would I bring it up if I don't know what's gonna happen? I'm making it as simple as possible. So I
Yes.
think that would be the key.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I brought it up was just to clarify if you're still gonna need a buyer representation agreement with the buyer, if for some reason you fill this section out, or the buyer non-agency agreement.
Yeah, one of the two, right?
Yeah.
A
Or
buyer
you could still have
non-agency, but,
the other
or
one.
you're gonna represent the buyer, exactly.
And I have the same case, by the way. So I negotiated with the buyer 2.5% of the buyer's representation. And it was before everything happens. And then I'm in the negotiation. And all of a sudden, after August 13th, seller said, oh, I'm not gonna pay commission. And it was part of the whole transaction that I submitted. And now we're kind of negotiating back and forth. So hopefully they're gonna pay up to 2%, but that, let's say, other half a percent, buyers gotta fill it up. So I'm doing what I could to save them money, but at the same time, he has to pay.
Okay, any other questions before we go? No? Okay. Well, thank you for coming, everybody, and we will see you next week.
Okay, thank you. See ya.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, let's do that.
We'll turn on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that Jeff brought up the Redfin question.
Does everybody have their cards in here? Yes?